Auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Peace, everyone. In this presentation, we'll explore the architecture of moral reasoning as presented in the Quran. As always, our approach is based on a simple assumption. If the Quran is the word of God, then it is fully detailed and explains itself. Rather than beginning with the later theological traditions or modern theories, we'll allow the Quran to define its own terminology through a pan-textual reading of all the relevant verses. In doing so, we'll recover the distinct meaning of words that have gradually been conflated in translation, causing an important layer of the Quran's internal architecture to be overlooked. So without further ado, let's move to the introduction. Before we begin, I'd like you to set aside, just for a moment, everything we have been taught about the relationship between the brain and the heart. In the modern world, we naturally think of the brain as the seat of thought and the heart as nothing more than a biological bump. So when people read verses in the Quran that speak about reasoning with the heart, many immediately assume the language must be metaphorical, or perhaps that it reflects an ancient understanding of human physiology. But what if that isn't what the Quran is doing at all? What if it's not trying to teach us anatomy? What if it's describing something much deeper? How human beings perceive reality, process it, and ultimately become morally accountable for the choices they make. One of the reasons this question has remained largely unnoticed is that two Quranic terms, Fawad and Qalb, are usually translated into English with the same word, heart. Once that distinction disappears in translation, an entire layer of the Quran's internal architecture disappears with it. In this presentation, I'd like to let the Quran define its own terminology. Rather than beginning with neuroscience, philosophy, or modern psychology, we'll simply read the verses together across the entire text and ask a straightforward question. Does the Quran consistently use Fawad and Qalb interchangeably, or does it assign each a distinct function? As we'll see, a remarkably coherent pattern begins to emerge. We'll discover that Fawad consistently operates as the inner faculty of perceptive awareness, while Qalb functions as the center of moral judgment, commitment, and accountability. We'll also see why the Quran locates moral reasoning in the heart, not as a statement about physiology, but as part of a coherent model of what it means to be human. And once that distinction becomes clear, a number of verses that may have seemed puzzling suddenly fit together with remarkable precision. Now that we have established our methodology, let's begin with the first of these two words, Fawad. Across the Quran, Fawad appears only 16 times. If we consult the earliest Arabic lexicons, we find that it comes from the root Fa Hamza Dal, whose original sense is associated with something being heated or burned over a fire. That imagery eventually came to describe the burning center of a person's inner experience. But rather than beginning with the lexicons, let's first see how the Quran itself uses the word. Notice something remarkable. Again and again, afida, the plural of fawad, appears in the same three-part sequence. He gave you hearing, sight, and afida. This isn't an isolated occurrence. The Quran repeats this pattern multiple times. Now ask yourself a simple question. What do hearing and sight have in common? They are not organs in this context. They are faculties of perception, the means by which we receive information about the world around us. So if the first two elements of the sequence are perceptive faculties, what should we expect the third element to be? The pattern itself strongly suggests that afida is also describing a faculty. an inner faculty that receives and processes what hearing and sight have gathered. This is why translating afidah simply as hearts in these verses creates a category error. The Quran isn't listing two faculties followed by a physical organ. It's presenting three interconnected faculties that together form the architecture of human perception. That observation becomes the starting point for understanding what Fawad actually is. Now let's look more closely at what Fawad meant in classical Arabic. Before the Quran, Arabic poets consistently used Fawad whenever they wanted to describe emotion at its highest intensity. They spoke of the Fawad burning with longing, burning with grief, or remaining steadfast under extreme fear in battle. The imagery is remarkably consistent. The Fawad is not simply the heart, it is the burning center of a person's inner experience, the place where overwhelming emotion, conviction, and perception come together. Now, here's where the Quran does something quite remarkable. It doesn't reject this familiar imagery, nor does it simply repeat it. Instead, it takes a poetic expression and gives it a precise functional role. The Quran transforms a poetic concept into what we might call a functional epistemology. We have already seen that Afidah consistently appears alongside hearing and sight. Hearing gathers information, sight gathers information, and Fawad becomes the inner faculty that receives, experiences, and integrates that information into conscious awareness. Now consider verse 53:11. The Fawad did not lie about what it saw. Notice how unusual this statement is. Hearts do not literally see. The physical eyes observe the external world, but the Fawad perceives something different. It apprehends the meaning of what has been experienced. It confirms that inner experience. In other words, the eyes provide the sensory input, while the Fawad provides the conscious awareness that makes that experience meaningful. This is why I argue that Fawad forms part of the Quran's perceptual architecture. It is the faculty through which we experience reality from within. Once we read these verses together, translating Afidah simply as hearts becomes increasingly difficult to defend. Within this repeated triad, the Quran is describing three coordinated faculties of perception, not two faculties followed by an anatomical organ. Now that we have a working understanding of what the Fawad is, the next question is, does it always function in the same way? The answer is no. A pantextual reading reveals that the Quran describes the Fawad in three distinct states. The first is what we might call an operational or calibrated state. In Surah Hud, God tells the Prophet, "We relate to you the stories of the messengers in order to make firm your Fawad." Notice what is being strengthened here. It isn't the body, it isn't belief itself. It is the Fawad, the faculty of inner awareness. The stories of previous prophets are not merely historical narratives. They serve a purpose. They stabilize perception, helping a person interpret present reality through the lens of truth. In other words, revelation anchors our inner awareness. The second state is the exact opposite. In Surah Ibrahim, the Quran describes the day of judgment. People are staring ahead in terror. Their eyes are open. They can see everything around them. Yet the Quran says their afidah are void. This is a profound image. The senses are still functioning, but the inner awareness that gives meaning to experience has collapsed under overwhelming fear. It is consciousness without comprehension. The third state appears in the story of the people of Ad. God says he gave them hearing, sight, and afidah, but none of these benefited them because they rejected his signs. The Fawad is still present, but it has become disengaged. It no longer responds to the truth that it is plainly before it. So across the Quran, the Fawad can be strengthened, overwhelmed, or suppressed. But here's the really important observation. Despite all of these different states, the Quran never describes the Fawad as diseased. It is never hardened. It is never sealed. It is never presented as the seat of belief or disbelief. And it is never the place where moral judgment takes place. Those descriptions are consistently reserved for another word altogether, the Qalb. And that's where the distinction between these two faculties becomes impossible to ignore. Now that we have seen what the Fawad does, we can finally ask the obvious question. If the Fawad isn't the center of belief, moral judgment, or accountability, then what is? The Quran's answer is remarkably consistent. It is the Qalb. Unlike Fawad, which appears only 16 times, Qalb is mentioned over 132 times throughout the Quran. And when we examine those verses together, a very clear pattern emerges. Whenever the Quran speaks about reasoning, belief, hypocrisy, moral corruption, hardening, sealing, or disease, it consistently uses the word qalb. Consider just a few examples. In their hearts is a disease. God has sealed their hearts. And perhaps most significantly, have they not traveled through the land so that they may have hearts by which they reason? Notice the consistency. The Quran does not say the Fawad is disease. It does not say the Fawad is hardened. It does not say the Fawad is sealed. Those descriptions belong exclusively to the Qalb. This tells us something profound. The Qalb is much more than the seat of emotion. It is a center of moral orientation. It is where we respond to truth. It is where we choose to accept it, reject it, distort it, or submit to it. In other words, the Qalb doesn't simply perceive reality. It decides what to do with it. This is why the Quran consistently associates the Qalb with accountability. A person may clearly perceive the truth through the Fawad, yet still refuse to act upon it because the Qalb has become misaligned. So the distinction is becoming increasingly clear. The Fawad is the faculty through which reality is experienced. The Qalb is the faculty through which reality is morally evaluated. And the Quran never confuses the two. Up to this point, we have been piecing the picture together by looking at patterns across the Quran. Now the Quran does something remarkable. It brings both Fawad and Qalb together in a single verse, allowing the text to explain its own terminology. This happens in the story of Moses' mother. God says, "The Fawad of Moses' mother became empty. Had we not bound fast her Qalb, so that she would remain among the believers?" Think about what is happening. She has just placed her infant son into the river. Every instinct as a mother is telling her to run after him. Emotionally, she is completely overwhelmed. The Quran captures that moment by saying her fawad became empty. In other words, her inner awareness was flooded by fear and emotional shock. For that brief moment, she could think of nothing else. Her emotional reasoning had collapsed under the intensity of the crisis. But notice what the verse says next. God did not strengthen her fawad. He bound fast her qalb. Why? Because what needed preserving at that moment wasn't perception. She already knew exactly what was happening. What needed preserving was her trust, her commitment, her resolve to obey God's command despite everything she was feeling. This is precisely the function we have been seeing throughout the Quran. The Fawad experiences the emotional impact of reality. The Qalb determines how a person responds to that reality. The contrast couldn't be clearer. One faculty is temporarily overwhelmed, the other is divinely anchored. For me, this verse is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Fawad and Qalb are non-interchangeable synonyms. Had they meant the same thing, there would have been no reason for the Quran to use both terms in the same sentence. Instead, it assigns each a distinct role within a single human experience. The Quran is showing us two faculties operating simultaneously, one experiencing the crisis, the other morally steadfast through divine support. We have now established that Fawad is the Quran's faculty of inner perceptive awareness. Now we come to one of the most decisive verses in the entire discussion. God says, "Have they not traveled through the land so that they may have hearts by which they reason, and ears by which they hear? For it's not the eyes that go blind, but the hearts within the chests." Verse 22:46. Notice what the Quran is doing. It deliberately pairs organs with their functions. Ears hear, eyes see, hearts reason. This is not abstract language. It is anatomy directly linked to function. Then the Quran removes any ambiguity. It doesn't simply speak of the heart. It specifies the heart within the chests. The qalb is explicitly located within the sadr. That observation becomes even more significant when we compare it with Fawad. Across the entire Quran, Fawad is never anatomically located anywhere. It is always presented as a functional faculty of reception. The qalb, on the other hand, is explicitly embodied and explicitly assigned the function of moral reasoning. The distinction is deliberate. Some readers attempt to collapse verse 53:11 and verse 22:46 into the same idea because both speak of a kind of seeing. But they are describing two entirely different realities. In verse 53:11, the Fawad faithfully registers an immediate perception. It does not lie about what it has perceived. In verse 22:46, the eyes are already seeing perfectly. The evidence is present. The Fawad has registered it. Yet the Qalb has become blind. Why? Because blindness here is not sensory, it is moral. Repeated rejection of truth has produced a diseased, hardened, and ultimately sealed qalb that can no longer respond to what the person already knows. This is exactly why the Quran consistently attributes disease, hardening, sealing, hypocrisy, belief, and reasoning to the qalb, and never to the fawad. The pattern is complete. The fawad perceives, the qalb judges, the fawad experiences reality. The qalb determines our moral response to that reality. That is why the Quran locates moral reasoning in the heart, not as a lesson in physiology, but because the heart is the locus of human responsibility before God. At this point, we can answer an important question. Why does the Quran locate reasoning in the heart? Because the Quran is not interested in what we would today call instrumental IQ. Modern education teaches us that intelligence is the ability to solve problems, recognize patterns, perform calculations, process information, and manipulate the world around us. Those are valuable abilities. But the Quran isn't asking whether you're intellectually brilliant. It's asking something far more important. Can you recognize the truth? Can you restrain yourself from falsehood? Will you act justly? Will you commit yourself to guidance? That is the Quran's concept of aql. You can possess extraordinary analytical ability, build civilizations, design advanced technology, manipulate financial markets, or develop sophisticated weapons, and still be morally bankrupt. From the Quran's perspective, that is not successful reasoning. It is intelligence without guidance. In modern terms, you might say the Quran is far less interested in instrumental IQ than it is in moral IQ. Not IQ that measures how efficiently you think, but the quality of your moral judgment. Not whether you can process information, but whether you can distinguish truth from falsehood and willingly align yourself with it. This explains everything we have seen so far. The Quran never says the eyes are diseased. It never says the Fawad is diseased. It never says the Fawad is hardened or sealed. Those conditions belong exclusively to the Qalb. The eyes may see perfectly. The Fawad may register reality exactly as it is. Yet, if the Qalb is corrupted, a person will still reject the truth that stands before them. The failure is no longer one of perception, it is one of moral calibration. That is why the Quran locates reasoning in the heart. The Fawad perceives, the Qalb judges, the Fawad tells us what is, the Qalb determines what we ought to do. And ultimately, that is what human beings are judged upon. We have now identified the two faculties. The next question is, how does the Quran maintain them? The answer is through calibration. The Quran doesn't describe the Fawad and the Qalb as static entities. They are dynamic faculties that God strengthens, steadies, reassures, restrains, or in the case of those who reject the truth, allows to become corrupted. Let's begin with the Fawad. In Surah Hud, God says, that by which we make firm your Fawad. The verb used here is sabata. It doesn't simply mean to strengthen, it means to make firm, steady, and anchored under pressure. That is exactly what revelation does. It stabilizes our inner awareness so that we can continue to perceive reality correctly even when circumstances become difficult. Now compare that with the Qalb. The Quran describes the Qalb very differently. The Qalb can be reassured, it can be made tranquil, it can be strengthened, it can be restrained, it can experience fear, it can even have terror cast into it. Why? Because the Qalb is not the faculty that perceives reality. It is a faculty that responds to reality. Take the battlefield described in Surah Al-Anfal. The believers and the disbelievers are witnessing the same battle. Their eyes see the same events. Their Fawad registers the same reality. But their Qalb responds differently. God reassures and strengthens the heart of the believers. He casts terror into the hearts of those opposing them. The difference is not what they perceive. The difference is how their hearts are oriented towards what they perceive. This brings the entire picture together. The Fawad receives reality, the Qalb determines our orientation toward that reality. One is calibrated for perception, the other is calibrated for moral response. And there is one more faculty that completes the system: reflection. The Quran repeatedly calls us to engage in tafakkur and tadabbur, to think, reflect, and contemplate. Reflection integrates perception with moral orientation. Only when all three work together do we arrive at sound judgment. This is the Quran's architecture of human reasoning: perception, orientation, reflection. Remove any one of them and human reasoning becomes distorted. We have now identified the faculties. The Quran now explains how this entire system is maintained, or how it gradually breaks down. It does so in one of the most profound passages in the Quran, Surah Shams. God says, by the Self and He who proportioned it, then inspired it with its deviation and its restraint. Successful is the one who purifies it, and fail is the one who buries it. This passage describes the operating system of the human moral condition. Notice what God says. The nafs is inspired with the capacity to recognize two paths: deviation and restraint. Every human being possesses this moral signal. Success does not come from acquiring it. Success comes from preserving it. Failure comes from burying it. The Quran is describing calibration. Every moral decision either strengthens that calibration or weakens it. Now consider what happens over time. In Surah Ar-Rum, God says that those who follow their desires gradually become misaligned. That misalignment does not remain confined to a single action. It begins shaping the qalb itself. Then the Quran tells us where that process ends. Then your hearts became hardened like stones, or even harder. This is not an instantaneous event. It is the cumulative result of repeated choices. The Quran describes a progression that every one of us should recognize. Action becomes habit. Habit becomes disposition. Disposition becomes identity. In other words, we are not simply shaped by what we believe. We are shaped by what we repeatedly choose to do. Every act of obedience makes the next act easier. Every act of disobedience makes the next act easier as well. Eventually, those repeated choices become who we are. This is why the qalb occupies such a central place in the Quran. It is where moral calibration settles. It is where repeated choices become character. It is where character becomes identity. The path to falah, true success, is therefore not believing merely the truth. It is repeatedly aligning ourselves with the truth until righteousness becomes our natural disposition. The opposite path is equally clear. Repeatedly choosing desire over truth does not simply produce isolated sins, it gradually produces a hardened heart. And once the qalb hardens, moral blindness follows naturally. The architecture is complete. The Fawad anchors perception, the qalb governs moral orientation, the nafs chooses between alignment and misalignment. And through repeated action, those choices become the person we ultimately stand before God as. We have now examined each of these components individually. Now let's step back and look at the entire system as the Quran presents it. Everything begins with two sources of input. On the one hand, we have reality. Everything we see, hear, and experience in the world around us. On the other hand, we have revelation, God's guidance, which defines truth, establishes moral standards, and provides the criterion by which reality is to be understood. These two streams meet within the human being. Reality enters through our senses and is registered by the Fawad. The Fawad is our inner perceptive awareness. It experiences, integrates, and faithfully registers what is seen and heard. But perception alone is never enough. The Quran repeatedly calls us to engage in tadabbur and tafakkur, to reflect deeply upon revelation and upon the signs of God in creation. Reflection is what brings revelation and experience together. It is through reflection that we begin to understand not merely what is happening, but what it means. That understanding then reaches the qalb. The qalb is where moral calibration takes place. It evaluates, it chooses, it commits. It determines whether we align ourselves with truth or turn away from it. That moral orientation shapes our actions. Our actions become habits. Our habits become our character. And over time, our character becomes our identity. The Quran is therefore describing a complete moral architecture. It explains how perception becomes understanding, how understanding becomes moral judgment, how judgment becomes action, and how repeated action becomes the person we ultimately become. Notice something else. At every stage, this system can either be maintained or degraded. The Fawad can be anchored or become overwhelmed. The Qalb can be reassured, strengthened, and purified, or it can become diseased, hardened, and sealed. The Nafs can preserve the moral signal or bury it. The architecture is dynamic. Every decision either moves us toward alignment with truth or further away from it. This is why the Quran is not simply teaching theology. It is explaining how human beings think, choose, and become morally accountable. It presents a complete moral anthropology in which perception remains available to all while the heart becomes the arena of truth, corruption, and accountability. The final outcome is not determined by what we observe, it is determined by what we repeatedly choose to do with what we observe. We have now completed our journey through the Quran's internal terminology. By allowing the Quran to explain itself through a disciplined pan-textual reading, a remarkably coherent architecture emerges. The Fawad is the faculty of inner perceptive awareness. It receives reality, it experiences it, it registers it. It is where acute emotional awareness and perception converge. The Qalb, by contrast, is the embodied center of moral reasoning. It evaluates, it chooses, it commits. It is where truth is either accepted or resisted. The distinction is consistent throughout the Quran. The Fawad is stabilized. The Qalb is reassured, bound, strengthened, or through repeated misalignment becomes diseased, hardened, and ultimately sealed. The Quran never confuses these two faculties. It assigns each a precise and consistent function. That precision reaches its clearest expression in Surah Al-Hajj. The Quran does not say that the eyes fail to see. It says that the hearts within the chests become blind. That single statement changes the entire discussion. The greatest human problem is not the absence of evidence. It is the refusal to respond to the evidence we already possess. The Quran therefore locates moral reasoning in the heart, not because it is teaching anatomy, but because the heart is the arena of responsibility, accountability, and conscience. This is where every human being ultimately stands before God. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this study. Our senses may faithfully report reality, our intellect may analyze it with extraordinary sophistication. But unless the Qalb remains aligned with truth, even the most brilliant reasoning can become a justification for error. The Quran calls us to something higher, not simply to think, but to think truthfully, not simply to perceive, but to respond rightly. Because in the end, we are judged not by how much we know, but by what our hearts chose to do with what we knew. In the next presentation, we'll build on this architecture by examining the story of Qarun. We'll see how the Quran uses this same distinction between Fawad and Qalb to explain one of the greatest moral challenges of our own age, our growing tendency to mistake emotional conviction and social outrage for moral truth. For a written version of this presentation, refer to my Substack channel, the link for which is provided below. Consider liking and subscribing to this channel if you found this presentation to be useful. Thank you for listening.